Chapter 20. You know how it will end. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Amongst knees to the chest and punches to his back, Daniel managed to take the mage out of the forest. At that point, a message appeared inside Daniel's mind. Just a wandering hero. First objective completed. Reward: 1250 karma points. Am I even a hero at this point? I'm getting paid after all. Daniel thought while an odd smile grew in his face. After leaving the forest, Daniel encountered the rest of his hunting party. What is going on? Where are the bandits? And who the hell is that? Said Stu. Daniel put the mage down and then gave the escort a grim look while saying, "Do you want some answers or do you want to keep asking questions?" He then looked at the whole group and continued, "I've heard screaming, so I rushed towards the forest. About a Hund." He explained everything that happened in detail. This time, the first to talk was the sister of the two siblings, Fiora. "You are saying that you've sneaked up on a dual elementalist summoner?" she asked incredulously. Garth, the old man in mimetic attire, responded for Daniel, "What is so strange about it? We are hunters, aren't we?" Of the hunting party, he was the most adept with stealthy behavior, as he needed to reach a certain distance to make good use of his throwing spears. The old man had noticed the few throwing knives strapped on Daniel's thighs, and the exact height in which they were placed, which was perfect for someone experienced to easily take them at any time. This had convinced him that Daniel wasn't a beginner at throwing knives. Differently, the two siblings were used to hunt in couple. The girl would trap the prey with her bolas, and her brother would finish it with his greatsword. Their approach was a direct one, while instead, Sella was an archer, so he didn't have a use for sneaking as close to the prey. Stu looked at the bag that Daniel was holding on his right arm. He didn't recall it being part of his belongings. "Is that the summoner's bag?" he then asked, all of a sudden. His look one of greed. A slightly disdainful smile grew on Daniel's face. He answered, "No, it's hers." Daniel had expected him to ask about the bag, but he had no intention of handing it over. What made him so sure that he would be asked about it, was the dark red 962 floating above Stu's head. He had noticed the karma of every member of the hunting party the very moment he had met them. He was about to start a journey with these people, and knowing if one of them had bad intentions, wouldn't certainly not hurt him. The siblings had an overall neutral number above their heads. Daniel had guessed that they had spent their time accepting missions within the Huntsman Guild, while instead, Garth's and Sella's were slightly positive. The only person who had a negative karma was their escort. Humph. Stu's eyes narrowed as he looked at the covered woman standing next to Daniel. "Who are you?" he then asked. The woman removed her cape, and what was uncovered, made them all think that calling her a woman was a stretch. The female mage happened to be a beautiful girl that seemed to be in her mid-teens. Her body shape was completely covered by the oversized green cape, but her visage was a spectacle to behold. Her straight hair flowed down her back like a dark silver waterfall. Her steep arched brows stood above natural swiping lashes. Her deep-set eyes enclosed a pair of emerald green irises, inside which, pupils as black as the coldest of nights could be seen. She had a serious expression, but it wasn't clear if that was caused by tiredness, or by her cold-looking appearance. The young mage took a slow bow. "My name is Yala. I am an alchemist of the Golden Cauldron. The rest of my group and I were attacked early this morning. I managed to escape, but I was found out when I lit a fire. Thank you for saving me," she said between heavy breaths. The members of the hunting party bowed in response, embarrassed about being thanked regardless of not playing any part in her rescue. The only one that didn't bow was the escort. His eyes were stuck at Yala's beauty. Lust growing clearer by the moment. While nobody noticed them, Garth's hand moved close to the spear strapped to his back, and Daniel's hand approached the hilt of his sword. "Let's go back to the camp," said Stu. Minutes later, the group had arrived at their camp. The eyes of Garth and Daniel had never left the escort's body. They both understood from the greed he showed towards the bag, and the lust he didn't bother to hide for the female mage, that he would have tried something soon. An additional reason for their alertness was that, in case he did try something, that meant that at some point through their mission, the escort would certainly try to silence them. Harming and stealing from the party one had been hired to protect, was a huge taboo. Anyone accused of it, if found guilty, would be blacklisted from both the mercenaries and huntsmen's groups. Unfortunately, the escort was usually stronger than the rest of the party members. Adding the fact that they were trained and used to battle against other humans, they were usually capable of wiping out the entire hunting party on their own, and get out of trouble by slightly injuring themselves and claiming that the rest of the party had perished during a sudden attack from a group of beasts. In that case, the escort would not be paid even if he delivered the beasts' carcasses or beast cores, as it counted as failing his mission, but he wouldn't suffer any consequence either. When they reached the camp, as the escort was about to say something to the female mage, Daniel said out loud, "It's Garth's turn to keep watch, she can use your tent, right?" "Sure thing, kiddo," said Garth promptly. A clear layer of frustration could be seen on Stua's face. He couldn't retort to any of their words, so he went back into his tent in silence. Daniel nodded at Garth, which smiled in response. Then went back to his own tent. Time passed slowly as Daniel sat quietly in his tent. In front of him, 3 books, various herbs, and about a dozen beast cores of various ranks. 2 were rank 3 cores, while the remaining 9 were of rank 2. This was the content of the summoner's bag. Daniel didn't know the last thing about herbs as he had never had a chance to study them, so he put them away for the moment. He also put the beast cores away, as he had no intention of cultivating right now. The only remaining thing in front of him were the 3 books. On these 3 book covers, clear titles were written in black. These books' titles were Fire Element, Flaming Wisp, Earth Element, Stone Skin, and Basics and Theories of Summoning Magic, Volume 1. It was the first time for Daniel to see magic books. He had never considered becoming a mage, as for him, magic was a world detached from his. But since these books had fallen onto his lap, he decided to try them out. The first book he decided to read was the Manual for the Earth Element's Magic, Stone Skin. Daniel was an agile person, and he was capable of reacting to a speed faster than others. But he had never fought one-on-one against another martial practitioner of his level. His entire preparation was his natural speed and the basic knowledge of movement, sword, halberd and knife throwing. The book was filled with illustrations which Daniel didn't understand. Weird symbols covered the upper part of each page. Luckily enough, on the bottom part, a translation was written in the common language. /The spirit connects us to the spiritual plane, /mana will be traded for spiritual essence, /spiritual essence allows the use of magic, /stronger the connection, the more refined the essence. /stone skin /channel spiritual essence into your body, /guide it through the pores of your skin, /form a thin layer, and turn it into earth essence. The book's translation was written in short sentences, but Daniel was still able to grasp the method. He closed the book and put it on the ground, before starting to practice. Since the moment he had fallen unconscious, that day in the forest, he always felt this thin connection to the spiritual plane. He didn't know how to explain it. He simply felt an entity inside him, which was both him and not. That was his spirit. If one tried to explain it, they would describe it like a well built within your house. You knew that the water within was yours, but you also knew that this well was connected to a much larger body of water. He could feel his spirit, but he had never interacted with it, until now. He focused on his naturally built ki and tried to channel it within his spirit. The reaction was the same as pouring oil into a bowl already full of water. The more ki he pushed through his spirit, the more spiritual essence he could feel run through his body. After a few minutes, he felt like he had reached the maximum capacity of spiritual essence he could hold within his body. He had tried to take more, but the extra spiritual essence was pushed out of his body and dispersed in the air. He now had two different kinds of essences within his body. Ki, and spiritual essence. These two essences were like water and oil, meaning that merging them was impossible. Their nature was simply too different, as if they belonged to different worlds. Daniel tried to focus the spiritual essence within his hand, and slowly pushed it through the pores of his skin. Nothing happened. He quickly realized that he didn't know how to turn spiritual essence into earth essence. He thought about it for a few minutes, but there were still no results, so he decided to give up for now. When he got up from his sitting position and tried to get some sleep, after touching the ground, he saw that a thin layer of stone slowly covered the skin of his hand. So it is like this. I am simply not familiar enough with the elements, thought Daniel while touching the thin layer of stone that covered his hand. His guess was right. Mages needed to spend a lot of time trying to understand the elements they wished to control. What they needed to learn was how to replicate the essence without being in direct contact with it. Daniel had started to feel excited about magic, so he grabbed another manual. But as he was about to start reading it, he heard talking outside of his tent. He then got up, and left his tent. In front of him, Garth was sitting around the campfire, and a few meters away, Stu was standing. Stu had left his tent in the middle of the night and went towards Garth's tent, in which Yala was resting. Garth had asked him if something was wrong, but the response he had received was an aggressive one. Is everything all right? Have the bandits found us? Said Daniel. Stu's face grew even more annoyed, and through gritted teeth he said, I have to ask a few questions to the mage. If there is a bandit group, I'll have to write a report. I'll come too, I was there, I've seen and fought them after all, responded Daniel while pretending to be collaborating. The escort had reached his breaking point. With his back exposed to the two, he said in a threatening tone, mind your own business from now on. If you want to go back to the city, ... primary quest started. Just a wandering hero, ... description. Save those in need. Second objective set. Save Yala from Stu. Optional. Prevent Garth's death. Optional. Kill Stu. Reward. Karma plus 200, plus 500, plus 100, / Golden Cauldron reputation plus 50%. Daniel's tone turned just as serious, you know how it will end. That's why your hand is on the hilt of your sword. Chapter 21 Inevitable Conflict. You are listening at novelfull.audio. You know how it will end. That's why your hand is on the hilt of your sword. After these last few words were spoken, a deafening silence filled the place. Daniel stood just 3 meters behind the escort, while Garth was still facing the fire. His hand was slowly moving over the set of throwing spears that he had left on the ground. A faint moonlight joined the campfire into a dance of weak lights. The only noise that broke the absolute silence was the constant howling of the wind. Shiying Swu, the escort's upper body twisted suddenly, following the arm's horizontal slashing motion. The aim was parting Daniel's body from his head. Fu Daniel's reaction was fast, managing to avoid the horizontal slash by dropping on one knee. Almost at the same time, he countered by throwing a knife at the man's neck. Swaying was the sound of Stu's sword parrying the flying dagger. The man was clearly an experienced fighter, or at least enough to notice the approaching spear at high speed. Fu swashed the spear, clashed against the escort's sword and was thrown to the side, but the sword didn't stop. It kept slashing diagonally towards Daniel. Daniel jumped on his 4 limbs to avoid the diagonal slash, he then twisted his body in the air and swung his sword at the man's wrist. Stu abandoned the sword and threw a punch at Daniel's body, which was still in mid-air. Unfortunately, he was forced to retreat once again to avoid a second spear that had just slashed the underside of his bicep. All this takes long to describe, but in reality, it had happened in less than 3 seconds. The escort's arm was bleeding, but the injury wasn't serious. He had underestimated the old man's speed and precision in throwing spears, but more than anything, he had underestimated Daniel. Considering Daniel's age, he believed him to be a cunning teenager at the second rank of martial cultivation. But after finding himself on the wrong side of his throwing knife, he realized that Daniel's strength wasn't any lower than the old man's. He was planning to fight seriously from now on. He lowered his upper body lightly and reached for the inner parts of his boots with his hands. Shying from them, he unsheathed two fighting knives. These knives had two sharpened edges which joined into a very sharp point. The blade was thin, and one could see how a slash from one of these knives could separate a part of your body from another. Complete silence reigned once again. On Garth's hands two short spears were ready to be thrown at any moment. The rest of the spears were once again strapped to his back. His feet moved slowly, pacing in big circles around the escort position. Stu moved his body in a way that could allow him to keep track of both enemies from the corners of his eyes. Daniel's eyes were glued at Stu's hands. He noticed how the fingertips of his right hand were pinching the handle of the knife. His worries had been confirmed the very next moment. Garth wanted to reach the opposite side, and try to divide Stu's attention into two, like he would have done while hunting for a beast. Unfortunately, that was a mistake. Fighting an experienced fighter was completely different from fighting a ranked beast. The moment the two had surrounded the escort, his body rapidly moved. He turned towards Garth, completely ignoring Daniel, which was standing behind him. His left hand moved rapidly, deflecting the sudden spear that was flying towards him at high speed, and with his other hand, he threw one of his knives at Garth. Daniel knew that, at some point, Garth would have been in imminent danger. So he waited until the very last moment, and as Stu was about to throw his dagger, a thin blade came slashing the back of his hand. The damage wasn't enough to stop him, but it made him miss the correct trajectory that would have certainly killed Garth. As Stu's knife flew, Daniel dashed towards him with his sword in hand. He reached the escort's back in just a moment, but as he was about to slash with his sword, an upright stab came from the left side of Stu's body. The knife dug into flesh and got stuck into something solid. Stu didn't think twice before letting go of the knife and twist his body to the right. His muscular right arm was tense as he swiped it horizontally at the height of Daniel's head. What he expected to feel was the crushing of bones and splatter of brains when met against his powerful fist, but what he felt instead was a disgusting noise of cut flesh which accompanied a sharp pain coming from his right arm. He turned around rapidly, and his eyes opened wide in shock at the sight that was presented before him. Daniel's back was slightly bent forward as if he had received a strong punch in the stomach. At his waist's height, a gray hand which resembled stone was clutched around the sharpened part of his knife. A few drops of blood dripped down his fingers. His other hand was holding his sword. What shocked him the most was the blood dripping from the blade of Daniel's sword. It was at that moment that he looked down, and he noticed it. His right arm had been cut cleanly off his body and was resting at Daniel's feet. Argarg. You bastard. I will fucking kill you. Shouted Stu crazily. Daniel ignored him completely and looked past him. On the other side, Garth was clutching his bleeding forearm, on which Stu's thrown knife had dug deeply. Moments later, the tent started to open slowly. The rest of the party had heard the shouts and had come out to check what had happened. What is going on here? Inquired Lego, which was the first one to leave his tent. The next voice came from the entrance of another tent, and it was Sella's. Are we under attack? He said while rushing out of his tent, bow in hand. Those bastards. They attacked me out of the blue. Tried to explain Stu while clutching his bloody stump. What? Said Lego as a stupefied expression grew on his face. He then grabbed the handle of his greatsword. At that moment, Fiora left her tent as well. An arrow was knocked in Sella's bow, and his fingers pinched the string tightly. He was ready to draw at a moment's notice. He is lying. He was heading to the mage's tent in the middle of the night," said Garth between grunts, his arms still bleeding copiously. "I wanted to question her," barked Stu viciously. A voice was heard coming from behind the group. Yala, the mage, had just left her tent and had joined in the conversation. "Swear a key oath that you are telling the truth," she said seriously. A key oath was no joke. In order to swear a key oath, one needed to use their key to nurture their spirit, as if they were practicing spiritual cultivation. But the thing about spiritual cultivation was that it required the practitioner's spirit to be completely calm. People's emotions were born from their minds, but what they affected was the spirit. An emotion would always make one's spirit waver. A wavering spirit wasn't something dangerous. After all, everyone felt strong emotions at any moment in their lives without any consequence. What was dangerous was trying to nurture a wavering spirit. Trying to connect a wavering spirit with the immense calmness of the spiritual plane would injure one's spirit, which if continued for long, would then shatter and dissipate. Prisoners, enslaved practitioners, dying spiritual cultivators that didn't wish to suffer during the last moments of their lives. Countless people within the infinite flow of time had taken their own lives with this method. It was through the constant loss of lives that the mages of old had created various methods to chain one's spirit to the body, in order to prevent slaves or prisoners from committing suicide. A similar result could be seen when cultivating one's body. If one cultivated their body with a wavering spirit, their emotions would grow stronger and deeper, to a point when they would backlash and damage their minds, and in the long run, would turn them crazy. In order for an oath to be deemed valid, one needed to receive a neutral person's key and use it to cultivate. The third person would then verify that the key was in fact being used to cultivate, and if there were no negative reactions to the swearing person's body, the oath would be considered valid. It was a simple way to verify if one's claims were truthful or not. Stua's teeth gritted at the mention of the key oath. He didn't expect for someone that knew of such a method to be here. This method was mostly used by the military and other powerful forces to verify the loyalty of their members, or the truthfulness of their reports. Yala rapidly explained to the group how a key oath works. She then looked at the wounded escort and continued, "You claimed that they attacked you first. So you should swear first." After earning the agreement of everybody present, she started heading towards Stu. The usual procedure was to place one's hand on the practitioner's back for the entire duration of the oath. But when she moved within Stua's arm reach, his uninjured arm flashed as fast as lightning. The next moment, Yala's back was pressed against Stua's chest, and around her neck, his strong hand was wrapped tightly. "One move and I'll snap her neck." Stu growled hatefully. He had been cornered one too many times. The eyes of everybody present grew hostile towards Stu. They now understood who was telling the truth. The only one who was calm was Daniel. He had been the only one to notice a small detail. Yala didn't appear to be scared. Sela pointed his bow at Stu, but he didn't dare to draw. Legoa's grip to his greatsword's handle tightened while Fiora's hands reached for the bolus hung to her waist. "I won't say it again." Cough move. And she coughed dies. Stu started to feel strange. A deep cold was seeping through his body. His severed arm had stopped bleeding and his stump's color had started to darken. The moment he noticed that something was wrong, his fingers were already too rigid to tighten around the girl's neck. His complexion turned paler by the second, and whenever he coughed, his saliva felt like crushed ice in his mouth. Pop Yala's delicate hands grabbed Stua's fingers, and after applying a bit of pressure, two clear popping sounds could be heard. She had freed herself by snapping Stua's frozen fingers off of his hand. Please she coughed on. Tried to beg Sua, but due to the frozen state of his body, he was unable to talk. Yala pressed her small hand against Stua's chest, and kept forcing ice essence into it. After no more than 10 seconds, every liquid within his body had been turned into ice. The last thing Stu felt before dying was the feeling of his blood freezing inside his veins. Once dead, Yala retreated her hand. She then bowed deeply towards Daniel and Garth. I was aware of his intentions since the moment I joined the party. She said to Daniel, then while looking at both, she continued, thank you for protecting me. Just a wandering hero's second objective completed. Reward. 700 karma points / golden cauldron reputation plus 50%. Whoa, saving that girl was worth 50% of a group's reputation. I wonder who she is. You've scored big here. Sua's voice resounded within Daniel's mind. Daniel nodded at her slightly, then walked towards Garth. You alright, old man? Said Daniel. Don't call me old man, you little monster. Just call me Garth, responded Garth without missing a beat. His voice turned fainter as he continued, thank you. Chapter 22 System Upgrade. You are listening at novelfull.audio. It was the middle of the night, and everyone had gone back to their tents. Inside Daniel was sitting quietly with his eyes closed. His entire attention had been focused on his profile. Dan Heel. Karmic Systems wielder. Age. 14 rank, details, Karma. 1969. Weapons masteries, details, martial arts, details, spells, details. System upgrades, details. A brand new section of the system had been unlocked, and Daniel couldn't wait to learn more about it. He then focused on the system's upgrade details, and a new window appeared. System upgrades LV.1 Reap what you've sown equals 500 KP, passive. Killing rewards the mirror amount of karma owned by the victim. Time is precious LV.1 equals 750 KP, active. Double the cost of karma points in order to double the speed of progression. Plus 100 of cost and effect. Max LV10, reduced cost LV.1 equals 1000 KP, passive. Permanently decreases the consumption of karma points by 10%. An additional 10% per level. Max LV.10, bonus points LV.1 equals 1000 KP, passive. Permanently increases the karma points received by 10%. An additional 10% per level. Max LV.10, second chance LV1 equals 5000 KP, passive. Once per month, the user will be brought back to 2 seconds before the moment of his death. 2 additional seconds per level. Max LV.10, Karma X luck equals 30,000 KP, passive. Your overall luck is dependent to the amount of positive or negative karma. Accumulate 200,000 karma points to unlock system upgrades LV.2. Daniel's jaw dropped the very next moment. The upgrades were amazing and he couldn't believe his eyes. There were some that could shape his luck depending on his karma, or even some that could bring him back to life. The stupor in his eyes lasted for a good 5 minutes. If one could see Daniel right now, they would notice his accelerated breath and his shaky hands. Ha ha ha. Look at you. You look like a brat in a candy shop. Ha ha ha. Sua's voice resounded within Daniel's mind, taking him back to reality. Daniel read the upgrades descriptions once again. How many features are there left to unlock? He asked to Sua. After a few moments, Sua responded with his usual vagueness. How am I supposed to know that? Such an answer was within Daniel's expectations. He wasn't sure what Sua was, except for being part of the system. But now a new guess had formulated in his mind. And that was, that Sua was part of an undiscovered feature within the system. He didn't have any solid proof to his claims, but after unlocking one feature after the other, he couldn't help but to convince himself that there were still many secrets to Sua's character. Until now he had simply believed that the system was Sua, as he instinctively knew the use of every unlocked feature. But that was simply because he wasn't aware of how little he knew about the system. What made him change his mind was the fact that, the undiscovered features, were a mystery for Sua as well. Daniel dropped the subject and focused back to the system's upgrades. I assume that I simply have to think about an upgrade to purchase it. He muttered to himself. Ha ha ha. Sua's laugh could be heard once again. I thought pretty boys were supposed to be stupid. Daniel had no intention of humoring Sua, so he went through the upgrades once more, and made his choice. Dan Heel. Karmic Systems Wielder. Age. 14 Rank, Details, Karma. 719. Weapons Masteries, Details, Martial Arts, Details, Spells, Details. Reap what you've sown. Time is precious. LV.1 System Upgrades, Details. I guess I should try this out, mumbled Daniel to himself. He then grabbed his bag and took out all the beast's cores that he found in the summoner's bag. He only had 9 rank 2 and 2 rank 3 beast cores. He had never tried to cultivate with cores above level 1, except for that one time where Sua forced him unconscious, so he decided to start with the rank 2 beast cores. His consumption without beast cores was of 3 karma points per hour, while with the use of beast cores, it would be 10 times faster. Of course, the karma system was only able to shorten the time required to absorb the beast essence and refine his body. It was in no way capable of reducing the amount of essence needed for the refinement. He would still need just as much ki or beast essence as anybody else. The only difference was that for him, the absorption and refinement was drastically hastened. Daniel knew that there was no way for these few beast cores to be enough for him to reach the perfect state of body strengthening. So he decided to refine his spirit instead. He was unsure of when he would manage to have enough beast cores to attempt to break through the perfect state of the body strengthening stage, so, since he had found a use in learning magic, he decided to practice it. After calming his mind, he activated Time is Precious and sat in a meditating position. He then started to absorb the beast essence within the 2 rank 2 beast cores he was holding in his hands. Daniel had never practiced spiritual cultivation before, but he had gotten used to sensing his spirit when learning stone skin. He remembered the content of the basics of spiritual cultivation, and started to follow the method described in it. He let the absorbed spiritual essence fill his entire body, and then gave up control over it, letting his spirit assimilate it slowly. Normally, an essence whose control had been renounced would dissipate, but the spirit was omnipresent within a cultivator's body, so as long as the essence was within one's body, the spirit would slowly assimilate it. Daniel focused on the correct method of cultivation, and in the blink of an eye, 2 hours had passed. 6 of the rank 2 beast cores had been consumed, and Daniel's karma points had decreased from 719 to 599. The karma consumption was exactly double what he would have spent without activating Time is Precious. What left him excited was that his spiritual cultivation had increased by leaps and bounds. From the early rank 2 or faint spiritual connection stage, he had reached the late profound spiritual connection, or late rank 3. As of now, his spiritual cultivation was almost on par with his martial cultivation. Daniel's consciousness focused on sensing the changes within his body. His muscles, skin and bones protected him like an armor, his blood was being pumped through his enhanced heart, and forced into every corner of his body through his dilated blood vessels. His physical body functioned like a well-oiled machine. The only difference was that now, he could feel his ever-present spirit flooding through the entirety of his body. No matter if it was blood, skin, organs or muscles, his spirit was a constant and quiet part of it. Feeling the changes within his spirit, Daniel started to wonder about the 2 types of cultivation. Various questions that millions before him had asked, but to which nobody had ever found an answer to. He understood the conflicting parts between the 2 types of cultivation, but why was there no problem with the 2 being cultivated together until one reached the second stage? This subject had been the center of thousands of studies through history, but no matter what kingdom, continent or race one came from, the answer to this question had been a mystery to any cultivator underneath the sky that had a genuine interest in practicing both types of cultivation to a higher level. Daniel wasn't any better at guessing than anybody else before him, so he put that question aside, and started to consider his situation. It didn't take long before he realized his major problem. I need to learn more skills. He mumbled to himself after opening his eyes. He was right. Daniel had been lucky to have fought against a member of the military at the third rank. Every power had their own speciality, and the military wasn't an exception. The speciality of the military was tactical formations. Every person who decided to take the military life would be required to study and practice tactical formations. In fact, part of the tests that one needed to pass in order to advance past the lieutenant grade was knowing every type of formations, so that, in case a war broke out, they would be able to make use of them. Individual skills were only taught to officers above the grade of lieutenant, like captains and captains of the guard. That meant that, had their battle been a 1.1, and hadn't Stu underestimated Daniel since the beginning, their fight would have probably ended differently. Luckily, Stu was only an elite sergeant, so his competence with individual skills were severely lacking. Despite that, he had still been a dangerous opponent to Daniel and Garth. What Daniel needed the most was to gain combat experience and learn fighting skills, like true motion or stone skin. Unfortunately, just like before, the first thing he needed to do was to earn money. The rest of the night passed quietly while Daniel pushed his spiritual cultivation forward, and after spending 3 more hours, and an entire rank 3 beast core to reach the peak of the spiritual connection stage, he finally stopped. Bright rays of light seeped through the small holes within the fabric of his tent, so he got up, and went out. Outside, around the faintly lit fire, the rest of the party was sitting quietly while eating. About 10 meters from the camp, the body of Stu was laying, completely covered by large sheet that the rest of the group had found inside his bag. All of them were experienced hunters, and waking up early had long been a habit to them. Daniel approached the group and sat on a large tree stump. He then took a piece of dried meat from his backpack and started to eat it quietly. Time passed awkwardly, until a voice broke the silence. It was Sella's. "What do you guys want to do? We don't have an escort anymore," he said dispiritedly. At that point, Yala left Stua's tent, which she had decided to use after killing him. She had heard Sella's question and decided to intervene. "What are you guys worried about? 2 of you are at the 3rd rank. Hell, Daniel's cultivation is on par with the dead soldiers," she said. The rest of the group, except for Garth, looked at Daniel with a stupefied looks painted on their face. They were aware that he wasn't a simple bronze hunter, but they didn't expect him to be this powerful. After all, he was just 14 years old. Reaching the peak of the 3rd rank at 14 years old wasn't impossible, but it would still require an abnormal talent, or at the very least, to start practicing right after being born. Yala ignored the surprised looks on the faces of the group, and went to sit oddly close to Daniel. Lego picked up right away and asked Daniel, "Do you think you can act as our escort if we end up in trouble? I have a contract with the Huntsman Guild, like you guys. I won't get paid to act like an escort." He paused before continuing, "But if we do end up in trouble, I won't just let you die." Daniel didn't know, but most of them didn't simply hunt for the sake of earning money. In fact, hunters earned more money than they needed to live a normal life. So what many amongst those who risked their lives by going out to hunt needed, was a large amount of money for one particular reason or another. For example, Fiora was terminally ill, and the siblings' only hope for a cure was to hire a healer. Garth was paying for his 2 daughters' studies, and finally, Sella was saving money to organize a wedding for him and his fiancée. "That's enough for me," said Sella right away. Lego looked at his sister fondly, then turned towards Daniel and said, "We are in. I'll come too. I came here pick herbs, so I won't steal any of your praise. Also, I am not so bad in a fight," she said while hitting Daniel's arm with her elbow, but the moment her elbow touched his arm, her eyes widened in shock and she jumped up in place. "What the hell?" she shouted. "Why that you were just at the early moderate spiritual connection." Chapter 23 The Hunt Begins. You are listening at novelfull.audio. What the hell? Yala shouted before whispering to herself in disbelief. Why that you were just at the early moderate spiritual connection. A series of confused reactions appeared on the faces of everyone present. Daniel's face was the most surprised as he jumped from the scare. What's wrong with you? He said through gritted teeth. Yala calmed down immediately and responded. Nothing, sorry. Yala's shock was understandable. The moment Daniel had touched her face with his hand to keep her quiet, she knew immediately that he wasn't the summoner she had been fighting with, as she had felt a spirit at the early moderate spiritual connection stage through contact with his body. The spirit she had felt now, on the other hand, was more than a full stage stronger. Such a progress in a single night was impossible. One had to understand that, Yala herself, was considered a genius amongst spiritual cultivators, and yet, despite all the help she had received, she had still taken more than a year to reach the peak of the spiritual connection stage. After meeting Daniel, all she could do was doubt her ability to discern the strength of another spiritual cultivator. That was much easier than believe she, as a genius, could be outpaced to this extent. Sinlia Mountain Range, Canyon's entrance, 13.24. After a long morning of travel, the party finally managed to reach the canyons that separated the mountains within the Sinlia Mountain Range. Various wooden signs had been placed at the entrance of the canyons, and right before them, various camps had been set. These camps belonged to mining companies, and would usually house miners and slaves, but right now, they mostly housed the hunting parties to which the mission of clearing the canyons had been assigned to. Daniel's party was only one of many. Lego stepped out from the rest of the party and said, "I'll go report to the head hunter and pick up our spatial bag. Wait for me." He looked around for a moment, then continued, "There has to be a tavern around here. We'll meet there." He then took off alone. To Daniel, Lego's departure wasn't a problem. He had already judged this teenager as a trustworthy person. To prove it, was the fact that he didn't attack the very moment Stu had tried to turn them against him, and instead, listened to both versions. Not to mention, he didn't believe he would leave his sister Fiora alone, if he didn't consider them trustworthy as well. Daniel saw himself in Lego, even though much younger. It took them a bit of walking to finally end up in front of a large tent. Loud chatting noise could be heard coming from inside, and it sounded like something interesting was happening. The moment they entered, they saw a crowd of at least 50 people surrounding a table, on which 3 people were sitting. On the table, a few cards were placed facing up next to a small pile of copper and silver coins. Daniel's party ignored the crowd and headed towards the counter. They then ordered some food, and sat at an empty table to the side. And it looked like a human. With the tail of a scorpion and 2 claws for hands. That's ridiculous. You're just a silver hunter. Had you really seen a commander steal back scorpion, your body would be half-eaten and rotting in a ditch inside the canyons. A rank 4 beast, no way a chump like you would have survived. For the next 15 minutes, shouts and laughter could be heard inside the tavern. Until finally, the crowd dispersed. The only people remaining at the table were 3 men, 2 of them completely drunk, while the other was smirking and moving the coins towards his side of the table. From what Daniel heard, he understood that one of the 2 drunken men at the table had spotted a commander steal back scorpion within the depths of the canyon. One person after another surrounded him when he started to describe the beast. They were all hunters after all, and if there really was a rank 4 beast within their hunting ground, they wanted to know. The moment the crowd dispersed, a group of 3 shady-looking men with dark gold ED badge on their chests, approached Daniel's table and looked at them menacingly. Their weapons suggested that they weren't here to hunt beasts. "That's our table," said the one in the front. Garth and Daniel ignored the man's words, while Sella's look turned into a fearful one. He was an archer, and in no way used to melee combat. Not to mention that the 3 were mercenaries. And gold rank at that. Each of them was way just as, if not more dangerous than their previous escort. Yala was the first to talk. The table was clean and you weren't sitting here. Also, there are other free tables, she said in a matter-of-fact tone after taking her hood off. When the group of shady men noticed Yala and Fiora sitting amongst their party, their expression changed from threatening, into faces filled with lust. One of them approached Yala and said, "Pretty mage, why don't you ditch these scaredy cats, and play with us instead?" His lips parted into a disgusting smile, showing a set of yellow teeth. "Don't worry, you'll always have a place to sit on with us. He added while slapping his thighs. The very next moment, before anyone could react to the man's words, another man had appeared within the group of mercenaries. His arms amicably wrapped around two mercenaries' necks, and on his face, the most carefree of smiles. This man seemed to be in his late 20s, and his slightly shorter stature when compared to the mercenaries, made him look slightly funny. He couldn't be considered a handsome man, but his carefree smile could convince anyone that he was the most innocent of men. There were no weapons strapped on this man's body. The only thing he had above his clothes, was a dark black badge wrapped in chains which was hanging loosely from his belt. The expressions within the group of mercenaries changed once again. They had just finished protecting whiny hunters, and didn't want to be interrupted when trying to hit on girls, so their reactions was all but cordial. They turned to look at the newcomer, but as soon as they noticed his face, and the black badge hanging from his belt, they froze in place. "Miss Yala, it's an honor to see you here," said the man with the black badge, while bowing his head slightly. He then looked at the mercenaries, with his smile always present. What Daniel's party saw afterwards, was something that surprised them greatly. One of the mercenaries underneath the man with the black badge's arms took a step towards the one that had been rude to the two girls, and punched him square in the face with all the strength he had. The rude mercenary fell on the ground heavily. His lip had been split open, and blood filled his mouth. But to their utmost surprise, he neither complained nor gotten angry at his friend. It was like he knew that he deserved to be hit. The man with the black badge took his arm off from the shoulder of the other mercenary, and looked back at Yala. "Please, bring my greetings to your great-grandfather." He then turned around and left. The group of mercenaries stood in place until the man with the black badge left the tavern. They then looked at Daniel's party, and bowed deeply. The rude man said through bloody teeth, "Apologies, my lady. Have a good meal." They then left the tavern as well. Silence reigned within the Daniel and the rest of the party for a few long minutes, until it was broken by Sela. "Who the hell was that? And why was he so polite to you?" Yala didn't answer, and instead, kept eating her food. It was Garth that answered him. "That's a rank 5 mercenary." At this moment, the cloth that served as the tent's door opened, and Lego entered the tavern. He quickly noticed the group sitting at the table and joined them. He then showed a large bag made out of what looked like a giant beast's bladder, and said, "I've got the spatial bag. Our hunting ground is 3 kilometers into the canyons. The numbers are decreasing, so the price is now 75 silver coins per carcass and 1.5 gold coins per core." "Great," said Fiora after listening to her brother's report. Legoa's face turned slightly more serious before continuing, "Also, I've heard that there were sightings of a Commander Steel-back scorpions. So we should always be ready to flee." Sela jumped into the conversation and asked, "When do you guys want to go?" "Tomorrow morning. We only have a few hours of light left today," Daniel said casually. After finishing their meals, the party split and went to rest for the night. They had agreed to meet at the entrance of the canyons at the first lights in the morning. Daniel had an entire evening to spend, so instead of going to rest, he left his tent and went towards the shops. There were only 3 shops. A smith shop that sold and repaired weapons and armors, an alchemist, and a bookstore. The bookstore was, of course, not a common bookstore. The entire store was a simple stand whose books didn't number higher than 40, and all of them, being books sold within a camp filled with hunters and mercenaries, were bestiaries, weapon skills and martial arts. That was the reason why Daniel went straight to it. When Daniel approached the booth, the vendor welcomed him immediately. "Welcome, young warrior. Is there a book in particular you are looking for?" Daniel looked at the vendor and said, "Can I take a look at the strongest sword techniques you have?" The vendor took 3 books from behind his small stand and placed them on the counter, one next to the other. Daniel glanced at the names written on the covers. From left to right, they were Splitting Key, Mid/Turn, and Through Stone and Steel. 2 of these books were slashing skills, while the third was a skill for piercing. "I'll take them all," said Daniel decisively. He then handed 3 owed money over to the vendor, and went back to his tent. The next morning, Daniel had spent the whole night practicing, so he was the first to arrive, and as the agreed time drew near, one after the other, the rest of the party arrived as well. Once regrouped, they departed for their hunting ground right away. After entering the canyons, they traversed 2 kilometers of rocky path whose sides were made of tall walls. These walls were composed of various types of stones and minerals, which gave their stony surface uncountable layers of red, gray and orange colors. At the base of these walls, numerous abandoned mine entrances could be seen. The signs of recent fighting were everywhere, as this part of the canyons had been recently cleared. The party took an entire hour of walking in order to reach the ground assigned to them, and as they arrived, they noticed another hunting party leaving through the way they had come from. Daniel and the rest of the party started to set the traps right in front of the marked scorpions' nests, then waited patiently. It didn't take long before they heard the unmistakable sound of keratinous little feet hitting the solid rock. They all turned towards the source of the sound, and saw a silver scorpion the size of an adult's forearm crawl outside of a hole in the wall. "Well, I guess this signs the start of our hunt. Who wants the first?" said Sella to ease his tension. Chapter 24 History repeats itself. You are listening at novelfull.audio. For the following 10 hours, Daniel and the rest of his party hunted down every single one of these half-meter-long scorpions the very moment they left their nests. The behavior of steel-back scorpions was unusual when compared to normal scorpions. In fact, they weren't solitary hunters. They were eusocial instead, and formed colonies under a single higher-ranking scorpion king. The scorpion king was a variation of the more common steel-back scorpion, and was called diamond-back scorpion. The reason why this particular species of scorpions was too dangerous to be left alone, was that these colonies were in constant war with one another. Their territoriality and aggressiveness forced them into constant conflict. These bloody battles would not only mean the reduction amongst numbers of colonies, but also the strengthening of the winning ones. Ranked beasts evolved by consuming beast cores of other beasts after all. This situation had forced Fury's hunting groups to set a periodical hunting seasons, with the purpose of lessening the numbers of steel-back scorpions in the area. This hunting season was so popular, that the encampment that would be otherwise filled with miners and slaves, would be vacated, and occupied by the large amount of hunters and mercenaries instead. Unfortunately, this particular hunting season had started sooner than predicted, with the consequence of many losses amongst miners and slaves. After 10 full hours, the numbers of scorpions the party had hunted was close to 100. The 2 siblings were an amazing duo of hunters. Fiora was experienced with her bolas and always managed to tangle the prey long enough for her brother Lego to have them with his greatsword. They alone had killed close to 25 scorpions. Garth's precision with throwing spears was impressive. Before the scorpions could hope to rush at him, or sometimes even see him, they would find their bodies being skewered by one of his throwing spears. The only downside was having to recover his weapons, and sometimes, stop his hunt to resharpen the heads. His preys numbered 23. Sella, with his 18 scorpions, was the least successful hunter, but as odd as it may sound, he was also the most skilled at it. His arrows would never miss a target and could easily perforate in between the scorpius and keratinous mandibles. Unfortunately, like Garth, he needed to recover his arrows after the prey died. What slowed him the most though, was waiting for the scorpions to bleed to death, since differently from Garth, he could not finish them from up close. Unluckily for the scorpions, the only parts hard as steel, were in fact, their abdomen and heads. The reason for this particular characteristic was, at least for Daniel, hilarious. These beasts had evolved by hunting their own kin, so they needed a back armor resistant enough to stand a strike of their own stingers. As they would often be struck by their enemies, and sometimes, strike themselves by mistake. These scorpions would usually lose this major flaw after their advancement to the third rank, as they would not only gain a stronger armor, an additional set of legs, and a better control of their bodies, but also, a rank 3 beast level intelligence. Daniel was a full stage higher than the beasts they were hunting, which made the hunt a walk in the park for him. So he took this hunt as a way to practice his knives throwing abilities instead. Every thrown knife would either strike the base of the tail, the soft jaws and sometimes, even the beady eyes of the scorpions, causing them to make a shrill scream and panic before being finished by a rapid slash of his sword. Daniel removed the beast core from the poison gland of the last scorpion he had killed, while the rest of the group prepared for the travel back. Once again, Daniel got to witness the mystical workings of the spatial bag. This hunt had not only been Daniel's first hunting trip, but also the first time he had come into contact with an item enhanced with spatial magic. Noticing Daniel surprised the first time he saw the spatial bag, Yala gave him a brief explanation on how enhanced items and spatial magic worked. Aside from that, all Yala did was follow the party quietly. She would never intervene in one of their fights. The only thing she seemed interested in doing, was picking the plants and flows that grew on the rocky ground. It was early evening when the party decided to head back to camp. The group's morale was very high. No major accident had happened, and their hunt had been very productive. Unfortunately, things not always go as planned. The moment they picked their bags and started to head back, they heard a slight tremble coming from the wall to their left. Their heads turned in unison, but all they saw was the usual large wall. The tremble grew stronger the more time passed, until suddenly, a crack appeared on its surface. Rocks and pebbles of various sizes detached from the wall and crashed heavily against the ground, lifting small cuts of dust. Daniel's eyes opened wide in shock as a shiver ran down his spine. He turned towards the rest of the party and shouted, "Run!" But before anyone could react, the wall exploded, making boulders and dust fly everywhere. The entire party had been swept up by a dense dusty cloud which blinded them completely. The only noise that could be heard was a deafening screeching scream and loud fighting noises. Daniel didn't know what to do or where his party members were, so he wasn't able to protect them. Luckily, the loud noises came from in front of him, so he was fairly sure that they were safe. For now at least. The source of the deafening noise was slowly moving, preventing the dusty cloud to settle once and for all, and allow them to recover their vision. It was clear to him that, within the cloud of dust, two powerful entities were battling. Moving at this point was out of the question. All he could do was to stand still and hope that these two battling parties wouldn't notice him. A few long minutes passed before the intensity of the battle started to decrease. The dusty cloud started to slowly settle, and Daniel was finally able to see the shapes of the battling monsters. One of them had a humanoid shape and stood on 2 feet, with an height nearing the 3 meters. The two details that convinced Daniel that he wasn't witnessing a battle between humans, were the 2 enormous claws placed where a normal person's hands would be, and the thick 5 meters long tail attached to his lower back. The other beast had a more monstrous appearance. Daniel could see a straight and thin body on which dozens of disgusting-looking pair of legs grew. Each of these legs were twice as long as the body itself, and were covered in millions of tiny quills. At the frontal extremity of this beast's body, a human dot-like thorax grew. This thorax had no head attached, and instead, several small mandibles kept closing and opening, as if pushing the food inside the beast's mouth, which was situated right in the middle of his chest. It looked like an enormous centipede with a human thorax attached to its extremity. Two extremely long antennae grew on its shoulders, and right below, were two additional long arms whose extremities looked like sharpened blades. Daniel remembered the description he had heard in the tavern, and recognized the first beast as the Commander Steel-back scorpion. He didn't know what the other beast was, but since it was capable of fighting on par with a rank 4 beast, then it probably was a beast of the 4th rank as well. More time passed, and the cloud of dust had almost completely settled. Daniel could see more clearly now, and was able to notice the state in which beasts were. Two words came to his mind. Severely injured. The Commander Scorpion's armor was covered in deep cuts which leaked white fatty liquids, and one of its arms was missing entirely. The other creature wasn't doing any better. Various of his thin feet were broken, and its back had been punctured right in the middle by the scorpion's Achilles. Daniel looked around and noticed that the rest of the team was further away. Apparently, they had backed away the moment the wall had exploded. They then remained at the edges of the dusty fog, waiting for him to come out. The other members of the party was Daniel standing there, but before they could feel relieved, they noticed the two beasts battling right behind him. The battle's pace was becoming sluggish, as the two beasts' exhaustion increased. Unfortunately, Daniel's cover had almost completely disappeared, so, while still afraid of being noticed, he tried to back away slowly. The rest of the party had already recognized the Commander Steel-back scorpion and went into hiding. The moment Daniel moved, he was immediately noticed by the Commander Scorpion, which looked at him and let out a furious shrill scream. It was during this moment of distraction that the centipede's thin legs moved. The beast rushed at the Commander Scorpion and threw itself against its body. The moment the centipede landed on the scorpion, it quickly caged its entire body with its thin legs. The scorpion reacted rapidly and pinched two of the centipede's legs with its remaining claw, tearing them right off. Its long tail also punctured its enemy's back again and again, in hope to make it retreat, but the centipede never let go. It instead tightened its hold around the scorpion's body, keeping it still while it tried to tear the scorpion's head to pieces with its strong mandibles. This was Daniel's chance. He turned around and started to run away from the two battling beasts, but before he could go far, the scorpion smashed his tail on the ground, then again, and again. The tail moved faster than Daniel could see, and whenever the tail hit, the ground would tremble. The Commander Steel-back scorpion was a rank 4 beast, so its hits were rapid and precise. It didn't take long before the ground started to crack. The scorpion was an intelligent creature, and knew that it was in a dangerous position. It was injured and it couldn't get out of the centipede's grip. Luckily, it had grown up inside these canyons, and it knew them like it knew its own body. The cracks grew wider and wider under the relentless hits of the scorpion's tail. Until finally, the ground started to cave in right underneath the two beasts' bodies. The cracks had reached way past Daniel's position, so when the ground caved in, Daniel lost his footing and ended up being swallowed by the enormous sinkhole that was created. When Daniel woke up, he found himself in a massive dark cave, laying on his back against solid, yet wet stone. The first thing he noticed after waking up, was a small-looking hole on the roof of the cave, through which faint moonlight shined. At his feet, he felt the calming feeling of water. He got up and tried to gather his bearings. He had been laying on a rock, right at the edge of a small underground lake. He then noticed the familiar colored boulders that had fallen with him, and after a sudden realization, a shiver ran through his spine. What Daniel had realized was that, if he had fallen a second earlier, he would have landed heavily against rocks. Instead, he had landed in the lake and had managed to survive, even though he had lost consciousness. Daniel could see almost nothing of his surroundings. The only part clear enough, was the small area brightened by the light which were shining through the distant hole on the roof. Clank clack, a few rocks fell from the top of a pile of large boulders, making the sound of rock hitting rock reverberate through the entire cave. Daniel had noticed this pile of boulders, and most importantly he had noticed the ghee liquids flowing at its base. Suddenly, one of the large rocks was pushed away, uncovering the large claw of the commander's steel-back scorpion. Chapter 25 Achieving Perfection. You are listening at novelfull.audio. The moment the big boulder was moved aside, Daniel went into hiding. One rock after the other started to roll down the pile, as the figure of the commander's steel-back scorpion crawled out of it. Its body was a complete wreck. The thick tail was broken in 3 parts and dangled without control, the side of his waist had been smashed, and the scorpion had been forced to rip that part of his body altogether, along with the leg connected to it, in order to free itself. Huge chunks of white meat dripped out of the impressive-looking injury. After Daniel was looking at the scorpion's conditions, he noticed a couple of moving legs hooking onto the pile of boulders, and dragging the body of the centipede out of it. The centipede wasn't in better conditions when compared to the scorpion, in fact, it seemed to be faring worse. While the scorpion's body was compact and resistant, the centipede's many thin legs, which spanned almost 10 meters each, were not as resistant, and even if it didn't die from the fall, it still couldn't avoid losing all of its legs but 4. It could still crawl, but the scorpion's poison had taken effect long ago. Without an external intervention, the centipede would die soon, and the scorpion will be able to consume its core and recover. The two beasts started to weakly attach each other once again. The centipede tried to pierce the scorpion's body with its remaining legs, while the scorpion tried to smash the centipede's body with the only part of his body that was left unharmed. Its only arm. Each attack did little damage, but Daniel could still feel the ground under his feet tremble under the pressure of the mighty blows. There was no doubt in Daniel's mind that allowing the scorpion to recover meant sure death for him. Daniel started to look for a way to finish the heavily injured scorpion, and after looking around for a while, he had an idea. He suddenly dropped on his knees and pressed one hand against stone, and one against the soft soil. He then focused on the feeling of the earth essence, and for a moment, he lost himself into that feeling. A few long seconds passed, before a faint earthquake made the ground shake once more, but this time, the earthquake hadn't been caused by the two battling beasts. From the rocky ground in front of Daniel, a bunch of small-sized rocks started to converge. They formed a small pile that increased in size at each moment, only stopping after they reached the height of 2.5 meters. These piled-up rocks stopped piling up, but kept moving, while still remaining attached together. They started to shift into specific positions. Soft soil made its way from underneath Daniel's feet, joining the moving pile of stones, and filling the empty spaces between shifting rocks. The stones and ground took the shape of a rudimentary golem. This was one of the elementals which Daniel had learned how to summon from one of the books he had found within the belongings of the bandit mage. The golem described in the manual of summoning should have resembled the summoner completely, but that was only at the stage of mastery. This had been the first time Daniel had summoned an elemental, and the final product was a humanoid giant made out of stones and soil. If Daniel had had enough practice with fire element, flaming wisp, he could have tried to summon a lava elemental similar to the one the bandit mage used. Daniel unsheathed his sword and stayed in hiding. He wanted to finish off the scorpion, but he had no intention of going against 2 rank 4 beasts at once, even if injured. It didn't take long before the commander's steel-back scorpion clawed the remaining 4 legs of the centipede and ripped them off one by one, leaving it helpless with hundreds of bloody stumps. Incapable of moving, the centipede could do nothing but squirm and wait for the scorpion to finish him off. Without missing a beat, the scorpion raised his only remaining arm, and smashed his big claw against the centipede's back at full strength, right where he had punctured it with his Achilles. The centipede's body split in half, and gooey green paste flew in every direction for tens of meters. The moment the scorpion dropped in front of the centipede's body, right as he was about to shove its face into its insides and recover the centipede's core, a sharp throwing dagger hit the broken part of its dangling tail, and cut it off completely. The scorpion let out a shrill cry and turned towards Daniel. It then bent its knee and propelled itself against him at an amazing speed. Daniel saw the body of the commander scorpion gliding above the ground while approaching him, and for a moment, he thought he was done for. But before the beast could reach him, a big stone golem dropped from above a large boulder and nailed the scorpion's body on the ground just a few meters before Daniel. The scorpion felt the hit, but that wasn't nearly enough to finish it off. It managed to pick itself up with its leg as if he was covered in soft sand, but that was enough time for Daniel. While the dying beast was pushing itself up with its remaining claws, Daniel rushed at him at full speed and slashed at its shoulder vertically. Normally, a rank 3 warrior could hardly injure a rank 4 beast, but this was no normal attack. If one could look closely, they would notice a thin blue light shine through the edge of Daniel's sword. Daniel had learned this sword skill right before departing for the hunting grounds. The skill's name was Splitting Key, and Daniel had spent a good part of the previous night practicing it. The slash had left a lingering thread of blue light wherever the blade passed, and luckily, it didn't stop when it encountered the hard shell of the scorpion, detaching its arm from the rest of its body. The scorpion, which was still trying to free itself from the soft ground and rocks, let out the loudest of the screams he had let out so far. Daniel felt his eardrums about to burst and panicked. He let go of his sword and covered his bleeding ears with both hands. Too weak to fight back, the dying scorpion gave its all with a final screeching scream, hoping that Daniel would choose retreat. The scream was so loud, that at a certain point Daniel couldn't take it anymore, and its eardrums finally ruptured. Under an immense amount of pain, Daniel decided to give up protecting his ears and instead, grabbed 2 knives from the sheath strapped to its thigh, and used the second skill he had learned, through stone and steel, to stab them into the screaming head of the scorpion. The pointy ends of the knives shined with blue light and perforated swiftly into the scorpion's human-like head. The hit was effective, but unfortunately, it didn't finish the struggling scorpion. The screeching sound kept going as Daniel picked his sword from the ground, and after focusing all his remaining ki on the edge of the blade, he used Splitting Ki once again to decapitate it. Only after the scorpion's head rolled on the ground, the sonic attack finally ended. Daniel's face was purple-red at this point. He could barely keep himself from falling on his knees, and his ears were bleeding profusely. He felt like he had been hit in the head with a sledgehammer and couldn't help but feel like he could vomit the entire contents of his stomach at any moment. Daniel was about to fall unconscious, but before he could drop on the ground, a soft layer of cool soil wrapped around his legs. Daniel couldn't move on its own, so he needed the support of the stone golem. He slowly walked towards the scorpion's body and sticked his entire arm inside the large hole left by its missing leg. There were no bones, nor muscles. The scorpion's insides were completely made out of a fatty white liquid that held no resistance against Daniel's arms. Daniel pulled out handful after handful of gooey paste, and after reaching the contents of the beast's chest, he finally felt a solid bead-like object with his hand. He rapidly took the bead-like core out of the scorpion's carcass, cleaned it with his shirt, and observed it carefully. There were no major differences between a rank 3 and a rank 4 beast core, except for one. The density of color of a rank 3 beast core was dense, almost opaque, while a beast core of the 4th rank resembled more a transparent bead filled with dense smoke. Daniel felt the terrifying beast essence contained within the beast core, and realized that its purity wasn't nearly comparable to that of a rank 3 beast, but of course, he expected that much. Reaching a different major stage didn't simply grant a quantitative change to one's essence, but also a qualitative one. Daniel pocketed the rank 4 core and walked slowly towards the centipede's body. Luckily, the beast's thorax had been smashed into pieces, so finding the beast core wasn't as hard. By looking up towards the big hole on the roof, Daniel could guess that various hours had passed since he had fallen into that sinkhole. He had good reason to believe that, even if the head hunter agreed to send a searching squad to look for him, they would most certainly wait for the morning after, as beasts became relentless during the night. Also, the head hunter couldn't force anyone to go look for him, and even if a good pay was offered, nobody would risk their lives to find a bronze hunter, which had fallen into a hole in the ground alongside 2 rank 4 beasts. Daniel's only option, right now, was to cultivate and recover. For the following minutes, Daniel forced all the remaining spiritual essence within his body out and turned it into earth essence. He summoned the stone golem once more, and ordered it to wrap around his body. He then let go of the control over the earth essence, and the stone cover became a solid cavern that surrounded him completely. He finally fell on his behind, and with a few painful movements he sat in a lotus position. In his hands were the 2 rank 4 beasts' cores. Daniel calmed his state of mind, and after activating "time is precious" he started to cultivate. His aim was, of course, to reach perfection within the 3rd rank, so instead of pushing for a breakthrough, he guided the beast essence into refining his body once again. A few minutes into the cultivation, and Daniel realized how difficult controlling the pure essence was. No matter how much he focused, a good half of the beast essence would end up wandering inside his body without control, and consequently ended up being absorbed by his spirit. Seconds turned into minutes, and minutes turned into hours. Until suddenly, 5 days had passed. While lost in his cultivation, Daniel hadn't noticed that the injuries on his body had long disappeared, and the 2 beast cores were now a fifth of the sizes they had been before. Something else he hadn't realized were the changes within his body. His muscles, bones, blood vessels and organs were stronger than ever, and almost on par with a rank 4 warrior. His spirit had evolved as well. In fact, it had become so dense that it could hardly be distinguished from his physical body. What was strange was that his powerful body, which radiated pure ki, was in no way an obstacle for his dense spirit. It felt like they had been made for one another. Daniel's focus had been interrupted abruptly by the familiar and intrusive appearance of a window within his mind. You can't do good without strength. First objective completed. Reward: 1500 karma points. * primary quest started. You can't do good without strength. *. Description: obtain enough power to protect those in need. Second objective set. Cultivate to the surrounding awareness of the martial cultivation, or the profound spiritual synchronization of the spiritual cultivation. Optional. Reach perfection before breaking through the next stage. Reward: karma plus 5,000, plus 10,000, time limit. 1 year and 6 months, 2 years. After Daniel finished reading the content of the 2 windows, he felt ecstatic. He immediately focused on his profile, and a new window appeared within his mind. Dan Heel. Karmic Systems wielder. Age: 14 rank. Peak rank 3 of martial cultivation, perfect body. Peak rank 3 of spiritual cultivation, perfect connection, karma. 1602. Weapons masteries, details, martial arts, details, skills, details, spells, details. Reap what you've sown. Time is precious. LV.1 System upgrades, details. Chapter 26 Gaining Fame. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Daniel's body was overflowing with power. The purity of his naturally produced ki was so high, that in comparison, he believed that the ki his body had produced so far, had been an incomplete version of his actual ki. His spirit wasn't any less impressive. In fact, he felt like his spirit connection with the spiritual plane was much clearer than before, and the spiritual essence drawn from it was so pure that if Daniel tried to use any of the basic spells he knew, he would consume very little of it. Feeling the hilt of his sword with his left hand, he decided to test his newly acquired strength, so he unsheathed it, and focused his ki on the edge of his sword. The edge of the sword started to shine with a pale sky blue light. Daniel walked towards the biggest boulder he could find, and sword in hand, made a slashing motion with his arm. A deep gash appeared on the surface of the 3 meters tall boulder. Daniel hadn't felt any resistance coming from the stone, as the sword went through it like a hot knife through butter. Unfortunately, Daniel still wasn't able of pushing his ki further than his own body, or the body of the weapon he was holding. Therefore, the sword could only cut what it came into direct contact with. Splitting ki had more advanced stages to it, which would allow him to expand the blade through ki, and even send slashes of pure ki through air. But with Daniel's current mastery of splitting ki, he was only able to sharpen the sword's edge. Daniel sheathed his sword with a satisfied look. He then closed his eyes and focused on pushing the spiritual essence within his body through his feet and into the surrounding ground. At an impressive speed, the rocks in the surroundings started to move and converge into a large pile, which a wave of soft soil covered right away. After less than 20 seconds, the pile of rocks and soil had shifted in place and taken a humanoid shape. This golem's humanoid shape, if compared to the previous golem Daniel had summoned, was much more defined. While the previous golem looked like a giant made out of rocks and soil with simple limbs, this one had a head, fingers, toes, and a bone structure made out of solid rock. Its face was still smooth and devoid of any human resemblance, but at least it was shaped like a face. Daniel looked at the two small rank 4 beast cores, and after thinking for a moment, he decided not to attempt to break through to the 4th rank. He had realized that his speed was too impressive, and if he were to cultivate from the peak of rank 3 to the 4th rank in just a few days, someone would pick up on it sooner or later. After looking up, Daniel noticed that the light coming through the hole on the roof was that of early evening. He didn't know how long he had been cultivating, but since he felt like he hadn't eaten for days, he believed that more than a day had passed. He needed to find a way out of this cave as soon as possible. The first thing he did, was to rip one of his sleeve off and wrap it around a small rod that he had made out of stone. He then soaked it with the scorpion's fatty meat, and made a rudimentary torch which he placed on the ground, before unsheathing his sword and one of his knives. He sat right next to the torch and started to wet the sword's unsharpened side with the knife's edge. His first few tries generated no sparks, but the more he tried, the warmer the blade became. He kept trying faster, and faster, until finally, a few sparks flashed past his fingers and disappeared in the air. It took him a few minutes to manage to ignite the torch, but instead of getting up and start exploring the cave, he shoved his hand inside the flame, and activated, time is precious. For the next 5 minutes, Daniel focused on the warmth on his skin, looked at the sinuous movements of the flame, and tried to understand the workings of fire essence. The torch was rudimentary, and only had the scorpion's fatty innards to keep it lit, so after less than 10 minutes after it was ignited, the flame had already extinguished. Luckily, thanks to the system's help, 10 minutes were more than enough for Daniel to understand the principles of fire essence. While still sitting in a lotus position, Daniel forced his spiritual essence out of his palm. He focused on the familiar warmth and wavy movements of a flame, and after a few moments, a small fire lit on his palm. The fire waved quietly, growing in size above Daniel's skin for a good minute. It then detached from it and floated in the air steadily. The flame kept becoming bigger and bigger until, when it reached the size of a human's head, it finally stopped. The floating flame required Daniel's commands to move, similarly to the way the stone golem was controlled, and like the stone golem, the flame was considered a summoned beast. More precisely, a flaming wisp. Meanwhile in Fury, within the decommissioned hotel was a large and elegant room. Inside this room, 2 old men were sitting while facing each other. One of them was the previous master at arms of the Carolus kingdom, while the other was an old man which, if compared to the hotel owner, looked much closer to their real age. They 2 old men were both in their mid-70s. This old-looking man wore a loose white robe, with 2 small golden cauldrons patched on his shoulders, and a bigger one sewn to his left waist area. From his body came a pungent smell which would make one's nose curl in discomfort. Whoever would smell this odor, would immediately recognize this man as a powerful alchemist. The 2 old men were having a conversation while sipping tea from a set of very refined tea cups. "So he hasn't come back yet?" said the old alchemist. The retired master at arms's brows furrowed and responded in a not too cordial tone. "I still don't buy that crap about wanting to thank him for saving your granddaughter. Mahaha. What reason do I have to lie to you?" The old alchemist didn't take the rudely put comment too seriously. After all, the 2 were old friends. Sure, laugh away. In the 50 years I've known you, you have never bothered to thank anyone that helped you. The best you did was to send them a few pill. Or a chest of gold. Commented the master at arms bitterly. The alchemist's eyes rolled back and responded with an annoyed voice. Again with the prices wedding. I thought you would have forgotten about that by now. Haven't I sent you a chest of gold? That wasn't even worth a fourth of the price of the present. You. Lousy alchemist. He then turned away and refused to comment further. A few quiet minutes went by as the two sipped tea in silence. Seriously. The kid is a prodigy in everything that regards martial cultivation. Why are you looking for him? The master at arms said seriously. The old alchemist smiled wryly and said, that kid cultivated from the early rank 2 to the peak of rank 3, and learned how to use stone skin. In a single night. He then sipped his tea, and added, he is a spiritual cultivation prodigy as well. How do we solve this? The master at arms' eyes widened in shock when he heard the words of the old alchemist. Are you serious? He asked right after swallowing the mouthful of tea he had in his mouth. The old alchemist simply nodded, and while looking at the content of his teacup, he said, a talent corpse has no future. For now let's hope he isn't dead. Back to the large cavern underneath the Sinlia's mountain range, Daniel had found a way to leave from the way he came. He had decided to summon one golem after the other and order them to take the shape of small sets of stairs. He would then give up the earth essence's control, so that they would turn into inanimate solid constructions. After a bit of trial and error, and a few heavy falls against the solid rock, he managed to reach only 6 meters below the hole on the roof of Th Cave. I can make it, said Daniel while avoiding to look down. A fall like that wouldn't have killed a rank 4 beast, and probably not even the new and improved him, but there were no doubts that he would break a few bones if he did. Plus, there were no lakes underneath to grant him a softer landing point than stone. He took a few deep breaths, and after mustering the courage, he bent his knees and took a huge leap upwards. The stone and earth stairs immediately crumbled under the weight. If one were to look from the edge of the hole, they would notice a thin arm appearing inside it, then disappearing the next moment. Daniel hadn't made it outside. But luckily, he had managed to grab a protruding stone with the tip of his fingers, and avoid a painful fall. He then climbed up slowly, and managed to roll out of the massive hole. With his back pressed against the edge of the chasm, he took a few deep breaths and shook the tension off his shoulders. He then got back up on his feet, and started walking towards the base camp. Base camp, 23.11. A guard was sitting quietly next to the wooden signs at the edge of the base camp. His eyes were half closed, as he was in the process of falling asleep. His large greatsword was laying on the side of his right leg, and was about to slip and fall on the ground. Before the guard could manage to fall asleep, a dark silhouette, which seemed to be approaching the base camp, appeared out of the blue. Before the guard even finished opening his eyes, he grabbed his weapon and sprung up on his feet. He then shouted, "Who's there?" The silhouette drew closer. The guard started to get nervous, so it shouted once again. "Who is Th?" But before he could finish, he realized that the silhouette belonged to a young man in his early teens. The closer the silhouette got, the more details was the guard able to see. The young man's body was thin but well defined, and his skin was completely covered in dirt. His clothes were in tatters, the only parts that weren't ruined were his belt, on which a long sword hanged on the side, and a leather strap wrapped around his left thigh, which contained a set of sheathed throwing knives. Various guards on patrol heard the sudden screams, and approached the entrance of the canyons. They then joined the first guard, and stood next to him, observing the approaching young man. The young man was, of course, Daniel. Daniel approached step after step, noticing the guards crowding the entrance of the canyon. What Daniel didn't know, was that he had become kind of famous lately. Apparently, an unknown party of hunters had come back from their hunting ground with one of their members missing. The party confirmed the presence of more than one rank 4 beast within the canyon, and had also requested the head hunter to send a searching party to look for the lost member. Usually, they would have gotten paid for the information, and rejected right away. But fortunately amongst that group, was a young mage, which after exposing her relationship with the current leader of the Golden Cauldron, was granted the help they had asked for. This group was Daniel's hunting party, and the young mage, was none other than Yala. Daniel kept approaching in front of the surprised looks of the crowd of guards, which after he got close enough, noticed the monstrous head of the commander's steel-back scorpion in his hand. Chapter 27 No need for a searching party. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Hey! Is the tavern still open? Daniel asked to the unbelieving crowd of guards. Then, without even waiting for a reply, he walked past them and in the direction of the tavern. The guard on duty turned towards one of the patrols and said, "Notify the head hunter, now." The patrol turned around and ran towards the head hunter's tent. 5 days had passed since Daniel's last meal, and he didn't feel like talking to anyone, at least until he put something in his stomach. He made his way across the base camp's quiet streets, and reached the tavern in just a few minutes. In front of the head hunter's tent, the patrol was standing politely. "Sir, there are news about the kid you've sent us to look for." The tent opened immediately, and inside it, a bare-chested man appeared. The half-naked man was very large, with well-defined muscles, and a few deep scars which marked them in an unmistakable way. Behind this large man's body was a bed, above which, a naked and flushed woman could be seen laying confusedly. This large man, was the head hunter Kier. "What about him? Have you found him?" Kier asked in agitation. "No, sir. He came back on his own," responded the patrol awkwardly. He then composed himself and added, "He asked if the tavern was open. He should be headed there." The head hunter grabbed a shirt from above his dresser, and put it on messily. He then left his tent and headed towards the tavern. Daniel entered the tavern in awful conditions. His clothes were a wreck, and in his hand, he carried the decapitated head of the commander scorpion, with knives still stuck in it. Despite the hour, the tavern was full. Most of the tables were occupied by a large number of people who wore the same type of armor. A full black leather armor with a mountain peak carved in silver on their chest and left shoulder. The rest of the tables were occupied by a few hunters, which for some reason, looked intimidated to a point where they keep their tones down. The only empty tables were those immediately next to another isolated table. At this isolated table, 4 people were sitting. 2 of these 4 people, were beautiful girls in their late teens whose revealing clothes left little to imagination. The mission of the 2 girls seemed to be to seduce the man in his early 20s next to whose sides they sat. This man's clothes were refined and elegant, and were marked with the same silver peak carved on the armors which many people within the bar wore. On his chest, was a golden brooch which had the shape of a pickaxe crossed with a shovel. The hairstyle of this man alone showed a rich upbringing. The last person, was a rigid-looking middle-aged man. This middle-aged man wore the exact same black leather armor that the rest wore, and long cape of a dark gray color. On the left corner of this cape, a symbol identical to the other man's brooch was sewn in silver, while on the right corner, a silver mountain peak was depicted. A silver pattern on the edges of his armor pieces, aside from the cape, was the only thing that differentiated this man's armors from the rest. Daniel slowly approached the counter and asked for any dish that didn't require a long time to prepare. He then walked towards one of the few empty tables, placed the scorpions' heads on it, and sat quietly. "What's this reek?" shouted the rich young man, now sitting less than 2 meters away from Daniel. One of the 2 girls giggled and responded in a coquettish manner, "Young Master Jite is right. Such a foul stench." The other girl, trying not to be left behind, added immediately, "I believe it is the tramp that just sat behind you, young Master Jite." She then giggled, while squeezing her soft peaks together with her arms. The young master turned around, and noticed Daniel quietly sitting at the table behind him. He immediately got up, but as he was about to make a scene, the middle-aged man's voice resounded within his ears. It said only 2 words, "Young master." The young master immediately turned to look at the middle-aged guard, and as their eyes met, the guard shook his head lightly. "He is just a brat," complained the young master. The guard sighed and added, "That's the head of a rank 4 beast." "So what?" shouted the young master. "Aren't you a rank 4 warrior? Kick him out of here," he then ordered. The middle-aged guard sighed once more, then got up on his feet and approached Daniel's table. "I have to ask you to leave," he said after getting only 2 meters away from Daniel. Daniel looked at him, and immediately, he realized that this middle-aged guard was no simple goon. Nevertheless, he had no intention of leaving. He had spent too much time without touching food, and even if he didn't feel the passing of time while cultivating, he still felt the built-up hunger when he woke up. The fact that he hadn't jumped on another person's table to steal their food, was already a miracle. The guard had no weapons on him, which told Daniel that he probably was a martial artist. He would have usually avoided a fight he had few chances of winning, but this time, Daniel decided to be stubborn. While looking at the middle-aged man, he said, "I'm going nowhere until I eat something." He then turned around once more, and kept waiting quietly. The entire tavern quietened, and every single one of the soldiers in black armor turned to look at Daniel. The middle-aged guard didn't take it personally, he simply added, "This camp belongs to the mining conglomerate. My master is the young master of one of the 13 mining companies of which the conglomerate is composed. Leave while I am still asking." Daniel ignored the man's warning completely, and kept waiting for his food to arrive. The middle-aged guard raised his arm and tried to grab Daniel's shoulder. He didn't want to fight this kid, but he still had to follow his orders, but as he was about to put his hand over Daniel's shoulder, his cloak suddenly caught fire. The guard promptly took his cloak off, and watched Daniel with a surprised expression. He was about to say something, but Daniel spoke first. "You should be careful around fire. Your armor may not catch fire easily, but can you say the same about your master's robe?" "What is that?" "Silk." A faint smile grew on Daniel's face when he reached the end of his sentence. The rest of the guards rose up to their feet, and grabbed the weapons hanging at their waists. The middle-aged guard reacted by raising his closed fist. This action calmed the numerous soldiers, and forced them to sit back down. "You don't think that, as a martial artist, close as we are, I would be able to take you down before you can cast a magic spell?" said the leader of the young master's guard. Daniel grabbed one of the knives stuck inside the commander's steel-back scorpion's decapitated head, and pulled it out. He then used, through stone and steel, to force the knife back into the scorpion's head from another angle. He then said, "You can try." Quietness reigned within the tavern for a few endless moments. Until, "Ha ha ha ha." The middle-aged guard started laughing out loud, "What a funny guy. Peak body strengthening and peak spiritual connection." He then sat on a chair at Daniel's table and asked with a smile on his face, "How many safe youth pills did you take to still look like a 14 years old? Though it's kind of weird." Daniel was surprised by radical change within the old guard's behavior. He couldn't help but smirk and talk back, "Talk about weird, a middle-aged man that talks like a 14-year-old kid. I have a young soul." "Ha ha ha," retorted the middle-aged guard before starting to laugh once again. The young master sprung on his feet once more, and started shouting, "Are you done? I said to kick him out. Now." The middle-aged guard looked back at his master, then said with a humble yet firm voice, "Young master, we should go back to your tent so you can rest. We have to take care of the master's assignment by tomorrow morning." The few hunters that were talking and eating quietly at the other tables, couldn't help but giggle at the scene. Humiliating wasn't enough to describe the young master's feelings. His orders had been ignored in public, and if that wasn't enough, he had been sent to sleep by his own bodyguard. That was an unbearable humiliation for him. As he was about to start yelling at his own guard, he noticed a massive yet messily dressed man entering the tavern. Mr. Keir. He had found a way to vent his anger, and restore some of his face. The head hunter. We don't lend our camps to hunters so that they can fill them with trash. He said out loud while pointing at Daniel. I'm sorry young Master Jite, but that young man is a member of the Huntsman Guild, and you have no authority to order a hunter around. Keir retorted immediately. This wasn't the first time that Keir had to handle one of the young masters of the 13 mining companies. The 13 companies owned all the mines situated in the canyons that the Huntsman Guild were tasked to clear, so every now and then, one or two would appear during the hunting season, and act all high and mighty against a few hunters. The young master's face turned purple in rage. He sent a deadly look at Daniel, and turned to face his bodyguard. Let's go. He barked through his gritted teeth. He then stormed out the tavern in large steps. The middle-aged guard followed the young master, and behind him, the rest of the guards. After the young master left, Keir approached Daniel's table, and sat on one of the chairs. You're Dan Heel, right? He asked, almost too politely. Daniel looked back at him and nodded. I'm Keir, the hunter assigned as head hunter of this steel. Back scorpions hunting season. In the 5 days that Daniel had been absent, Keir had received various communications from Fury's Huntsman Guild branch. He had been requested to conduct a search party to find the disappeared member of a hunting party. At first, Keir had believed that this young man was simply the son of one of the high-ranking hunters, but after he reported his failed attempts to find him, he had learned that the request came from 2 external powers. One came from the Golden Cauldron's upper echelons, while the other was none other than the previous master at arms of the Careless Kingdom. This information, at the time, had left him shaking in his boots. You're not here to ask me to leave the tavern, right? I'm starving, said Daniel, before looking at the rank 4 scorpion's skull and adding, do you think I can pay with this? Keir smirked, and then said, there is no need, your party members left your part of the pay with me. He then looked at the decapitated head above the table, and added, I'll also give you the bounty for the rank 4 scorpion that the guild gave me as a reward for the incoming rank 4 hunters. Is the rest of my party fine? Asked Daniel. Keir's impression of Daniel increased exponentially after he heard him mention his teammates. The mage left right away, the old man should still be around, and the others left at some point during these past 5 days. Daniel's eyes opened in surprise, and then asked, 5 days. Is that how long I've been gone? Chapter 28 Background Developments. You are listening at novelfull.audio. What do you mean? Asked Keir curiously. After Daniel realized what he had just asked, he explained himself. I've explored the caverns underneath the canyons, I wasn't really aware of the time. Keir's eyebrows arched slightly. Ah, that's what happened. Your party members said there were 2 beasts battling. What happened to them? Well, to the other one at least, the 2 beasts were grabbing each other when the ground. Daniel started to tell what had happened the day of their first hunt, of how the 2 beasts came out of a wall, how they battled fiercely and made the ground collapse, exposing the massive cage underneath it. I'm not too bad with throwing knives and using a sword. Plus, the scorpion was heavily injured. Keir was amazed by Daniel's survival ability, and after a minute, with a thoroughly impressed expression on his face, he said, well, if you want to sell the beast cores to the guild, I can pay for them. But if you want to keep them, then go ahead. You didn't accept a mission for the hunt of rank 4 beasts anyway, so you have no obligations to hand them over. At that moment, a robust-looking woman appeared next to Daniel's table. In her hands, she held 2 plates filled with food. Can I ask you something? Keir asked to Daniel, as he rudely started to scarf food down his throat. How did you manage to get the attention of both the previous master at arms and the vice president of the Golden Cauldron? Coincidence, said Daniel with his mouth still full. He then swallowed heavily and said, I moved into the master at arms building. And about the vice leader of the Golden Cauldron? I guess it's because I saved the mage from bandits. Ha! Talk about luck! Exclaimed Kier, once again surprised. I'll let you eat in peace. Come find me tomorrow morning and I'll give you your money. Also, I've been asked to send you back home, said Kier, right before getting up from his chair and walking out of the tavern. The moment Kier left the tavern, the majority of the remaining hunters sprung up on their feet and approached Daniel. They occupied the free chairs or crowded around him. Hey kiddo, tell us about the battle between the beasts. How in the hell did you manage get out of that cave? Wanna play those cores in a game of cards? He. For the rest of the night, Daniel became the star of the base camp's tavern. The following day, Daniel woke up on a bed inside of his tent. He washed himself up and put on some fresh clothes. Then sat back on his bed and started to think about his situation. It's been almost 10 days since I've been home, and I've made enough money for now. I should go back. Plus, I have points to spend. I wonder if the old man would still want me as his student. On Daniel's face a faint smile grew the moment he thought about how many skills a kingdom's master .arms would have to teach. With his first thoughts of greed still lingering in his mind, he walked towards Kier's office. Right outside of Kier's office, the beautiful girl that was laying naked on his bed the night prior, was now completely dressed. Her expression was a professional one. Dan Heel. She asked. That's me, replied Daniel. The woman got up from her chair and walked towards Kier's office. She then opened the door and made a gesture with her arm, inviting Daniel to enter. Inside his office, Kier was sitting behind his desk. Dan. Come, sit down, said Kier. Daniel entered the office and sat on a chair in front of Kier's desk. Once comfortable, he looked at Kier and asked, yesterday you said that you've been asked to send me back. Was it a request from the old man or the vice leader of the Golden Cauldron? Both actually, responded Kier. He then started to rummage inside his desk's drawer, until it took a small bag out of it. Here's your gold and the bounty for the rank 4 beasts. I've selected a few guards that can escort you back to Fury. Daniel was about to get up and leave, but before he could, a thought flashed through his mind. I have something to do here. Do you know where I can find someone from the Silver Peak Mining Company? Kier's face turned awkward for a moment. Actually, yes. But you won't like it. What do you mean? Asked Daniel confusedly. With a matter-of-fact tone, Kier answered immediately, remember the young master who wanted to kick you out of the tavern? Ah. Fuck. Said Daniel dispiritedly. Kier couldn't help but ask, why do you need to talk to someone from the Silver Peak Mining Company? I wanted to buy one of their slaves. Daniel's voice grew more depressed by the word. His hand brushing against his forehead. Kier started to write something on a piece of paper, and then handed it over to Daniel. Well, if you want to avoid the guy, go directly to their main base. This is their address within the Learn District. But I doubt you'll be allowed in, he said. Daniel kept the piece of paper inside his new shirt and said, thank you, I owe you one. Kier smirked and said, I'll collect that debt when one of your favors will be worth something. Hee. 1 hour later, Daniel had reached the base camp's border. Waiting for him was a group of people. Amongst this group of people was a familiar face. Wearing his usual mimetic attire, and carrying his usual bunch of throwing spears, Garth sat quietly next to a tree, ignoring the rest of the chatting members of the group. Most of the group's members were silver rank mercenaries, while the remaining few had a gold badge hanging from their belts. So that fall didn't kill you? I owe a few copper to the youngster with the weird nose, said Garth with a fake disappointed tone. Daniel looked at him and smiled. He then said, if you thought I was dead, what are you doing still here? Long naps. Mostly, responded Garth while smirking. After a couple more back and forth, the two approached the rest of the group. They then departed for Fury. Fury, Master. Arms Hotel in the lobby, sitting around a table, were the old alchemist and Rayla. 2 days had passed since the old Master. Arms and the old alchemist had received the news of Daniel's return. Since then, they had started a sort of competition about who would manage to take him in first. They were opposites. The Master. Arms was an expert in all kinds of weapons, and a powerful cultivator at the 7th rank of martial cultivation, while the old alchemist was a known alchemist, a powerful mage, and a 7th rank spiritual cultivator. Both of them had learned about Daniel's prodigious talent in cultivation and learning, either by witnessing it themselves or, like in the case of the old alchemist, witnessed from his granddaughter. Both of these figures had built huge reputations within the Carolus kingdom. The ways of the Master. Arms had always been honest and direct, while the old alchemist's ways were more cunning and calculative. During their many years of friendship, they had challenged each other more than once, and this time, the challenge regarded gaining a talented disciple. Naturally, they were more than aware that the decision would depend on Daniel's choice regarding his path of cultivation. Path which the Master. Arms was fairly convinced to be martial cultivation. And yet, the old alchemist still tried to put a few fast ones on his old friend. Like befriending Daniel's sister, Rayla. Had always been a good kid, said Rayla to the old man, with eyes filled with unrelenting pride. The girl's pride made the old alchemist smile warmly. He had talked to this diffident and sharp teenage girl for the past half an hour, and he had understood one thing. Gaining her trust was a feat. I am sure he is. I can't wait to thank him personally for saving my granddaughter's life. The old alchemist finished his tea and added, it was a pleasure talking to such a bright kid, and my apologies for interrupting your studies, I'll leave you to them. Excuse me, you didn't disturb, sir? Said Rayla while smiling politely and blowing gently. After bidding farewell, the old alchemist left. Back inside the Master. Arms room, the two old men were sitting and chatting like they often did. What a couple of freaks, said the old alchemist with an annoyed tone. I've talked to that girl for half an hour and I know less about that kid than I did before. The old Master. Arms clearly enjoyed seeing his old friend in that state. He decided to poke the bear by saying, oh, she is just protective towards her brother. Which older sister wouldn't be worried if a suspicious old man started to ask questions about their little brother? Who's a suspicious old man? You're one to talk. Opening a school on your own. Attracting kids from left and right. You're the one that they need to be on the lookout for. Retorted the old alchemist bitterly. The old Master. Arms didn't take the comment at heart, he instead giggled and went back to sipping his tea. A look of realization flashed on the old alchemist's face. He then looked at the old Master. Arms and asked him, didn't the brat come here with 2 girls? Who's the other one? The faint smile on the hotel owner's face disappeared completely. He stared at his teacup for a full minute, before saying in a low voice, there's daughter. The old alchemist's eyes flashed open. Are you kidding? How in the hell did she end up in your hotel to begin with? That's too much of a coincidence. He inquired with an everlasting surprise in his voice. She had been taken as a slave. The brat bought her at an auction, and then freed her before even leaving the building. Clarified the old Master. Arms. The old alchemist smirked and said, smart kid. He can see the big picture. Think of who's going to owe him a favor when. If. His father will come back. He didn't know who she was when he bought her. Said the old Master. Arms, correcting his old friend's train of thought. Once learned the truth, the smile on the old alchemist grew 2 times larger. The more I hear about this brat, the more I like him. He. After the old alchemist's laugh, the two finished their tea in silence. 2 quiet minutes passed before the old alchemist broke the silence by asking, you are keeping her here? I have to. Responded the old Master. Arms. The old alchemist's brows narrowed as he looked at his old friend. Students of the School of Everlasting Fury will sooner or later make their way here. You haven't refused anyone since you've taken in the 3. You can't start with them. It'll look suspicious. What if they send someone who can recognize her? He asked with a dead serious tone. The old master ... Arms looked lost for a moment, then, he seemed to have made a decision within his mind. He turned to look at his friend, and said, "Nobody touches one of my students. You better hope it doesn't come to that. I've heard that the master of the School of Everlasting Fury has been trying to break through to the 8th rank for days now," said the old alchemist casually, trying to scale back his old friend's resolve to fight it out with his student's old enemy. He then added, "Plus, you're not the master ... Arms anymore. If His Majesty finds out, he'll never take your side over his." The room turned quiet once more, and after a few minutes, the first to break the silence, was once again, the old alchemist. "Where the hell is that brat? I feel like I've been waiting here forever." The old alchemist complained in a way most would define slightly childish. "He'll be here by tomorrow," responded the old master ... Arms. Chapter 29 A Strange Day. You are listening at novelfull.audio. It was early morning when Daniel's group arrived at Fury's gates. They entered the city from the southern walls, and once in, Daniel bid farewell to Garth and the rest, and headed towards the hotel. He really wanted to see his sister. Once in front of the building, Daniel stood with his jaw wide open. The amount of people lingering in front of the building's entrance was incomparable to the one he had left behind. In fact, there were so many people that, weren't they all young men in their early 20s or late teens, he would have believed that the old man had reopened the hotel. Daniel tried to push his way into the building, when, "Hey! Don't skip the line," said a young man in tight yet refined clothes. Slightly annoyed, Daniel tried to explain himself. "Actually, I live," but he was interrupted by other voices. A girl in her late teens which was hugging 3-sheathed short sword, said sourly, "Actually what? We've been here for hours. Even if you were the long-lost children of the previous master ... Arms, you still have to wait for your turn." Daniel gritted his teeth in annoyance. He then tried once more, "I was just saying that but he was interrupted again. "To the back of the line," said another young man which wore refined clothes. Each of these young men and women were the geniuses that came from the groups placed outside the city of Fury. The first group that had managed to secure a place within the old master ... Arms building, were members of the powers within the city. Which, whereas they lived nearby, they had arrived earlier. The rest needed more time to arrive. Daniel was slowly pushed on the borders of the crowd, and at the back of the line. Fine. He wasn't willing to wait in line to enter his own house, so instead of waiting, he located an opened window on the frontal wall of the building, and started to walk towards the wall. The people who were patiently waiting in line, noticed Daniel walking towards a wall with conviction. Their puzzled looks rapidly turned into ones of mockery and derision. From their point of view, Daniel had gone crazy. Daniel kept walking, until there were just 5 meters between him and the wall. He then lifted his leg, as if walking over the first step of a set of stairs, and before his foot could touch the ground, a stone stair rose from the ground, then another, and another. Daniel walked over this set of stairs, which disappeared as soon as he moved on to the next. He kept going until he reached the opened window, crawled inside it, and closed it. The people on the ground looked at one another in silent confusion. The first to talk was the young girl which was embracing the short swords. Is that allowed?" On the other side of the window which Daniel had entered from, was a messy room. Daniel wanted to make a B. line for door, but as he heard laughs and giggles on the other side, he had no choice but to hide in a dark corner of the room instead. In front of him a young couple appeared. The young man and woman were embracing each other, and crashing against every piece of furniture within the room. From the verses and mess the two were making, Daniel wasn't sure if the two were kissing, or trying to kill each other. Needless to say, Daniel was embarrassed beyond words. He could only try to reduce the space he occupied, and stay as quiet as possible. The two started to take pieces of clothing off of each other, throwing them around randomly. Daniel was trying to find the right way to sneak out of the room, when suddenly, an indiment landed on his head. Daniel stood as still as a statue, then, after making sure the couple hadn't noticed him, he slowly raised his hand and pinched the piece of clothing that was resting over his head. He felt the soft fabric, and for a moment, he thought that a soft pair of female's undergarment had landed on him. But when his eyes landed on the item, he noticed the familiar shape of the piece of clothing. They were a pair of men's undergarment. "Fuck. That's it!" shouted Daniel loudly. He then threw the young man's underwear on the ground, and while covering his face with his large sleeve, he stormed out of the room in rage. The couple had been scared to death. The two quickly rose up from the bed, as their eyes rapidly explored the room. They then noticed the figure dashing towards the door. When the young man noticed Daniel, he said, "Hey. Hold on." But before he could finish, a small fireball flew in his direction and exploded right in his face. The girl covered her face by instinct, but all she heard was the sound of the door opening and closing. She then looked to her right, and noticed the shocked look in her boyfriend's face. And his slightly burnt hair. Daniel ran through corridors as if a demon was chasing him. He had no intention of being seen there, when the rumors would start to spread. The first thing Daniel did, was to go back to his room and change his clothes. He then walked out, and went to knock at his sister's room. Unfortunately, nobody answered. He was about to walk away, when a sweet-sounding voice reached his ears from behind. "You are back." Daniel turned around, and saw Maya. She was as beautiful as ever, and if compared to the state she was in when he freed her, she seemed to have even recovered a bit of her personality. Daniel smiled at her, then said, "I am. How have you been doing?" Maya still felt a bit of embarrassment when talking to Daniel. He had done a great favor to her, and had never asked for anything in return. Behaving naturally with someone to whom she owed so much, was extremely difficult to her. "I am doing great, I love this place." She responded just as politely, then added, "How did your hunting trip go?" "Fruitful. I went to tea." Daniel hadn't spent much time with Maya, but his opinion of her was that of a sweet girl, which had led a difficult life. She had also been the first person whose life Daniel had saved, so he couldn't help but feel responsible for her. The two talked for a bit, then Daniel, unable to find his sister, went to see the building owner. He arrived at the building owner's room, and heard talking coming from the other side. He knocked. After a few moments, he heard an old voice saying, "Come in." Daniel opened the door and entered the building owner's room. Inside it, he found two old men sitting at the table and drinking tea, like they often did. "Finally!" exclaimed the old alchemist loudly. He then sprung up from his chair and dashed towards Daniel. His hand moved before Daniel could react and grabbed his wrist. "Ha! The brat is at the peak of spiritual connection. There is no way he is a martial cultivator," said the old alchemist at the old master. Arms, as a scary smirk grew on his face. Ednel.co Daniel retracted his hand and looked at the old master. Arms with an inquisitive look. The old master. Arms placed his teacup on the table, and said, "This is the vice leader of the Golden Cauldron. You saved his granddaughter a week ago." Daniel's eyes narrowed. He hadn't received a proper thank you from the old man, but he still couldn't afford to act rudely. He bowed his head slightly, and introduced himself, "Greetings, sir, my name is Dan Heel." Hey, don't be so formal. I'm here to thank you for saving my beloved granddaughter." "Haha," said the old alchemist with an oddly friendly attitude. Daniel looked at the two old men and said, "I came here to thank you for sending a rescue party to find me." He then bowed once again. "That's the least we could have done," responded the old alchemist promptly, then added, "I've heard from my granddaughter that you have a talent for spiritual cultivation. Say, would you like to join my golden cauldron, and become one of my students? Might not look like it, but I'm a powerful mage myself. He, Daniel had expected such an invitation. He had doubted that such a prominent figure like the vice leader of one of the biggest groups within the Careless Kingdom, would order for his rescue simply to thank him, so he had prepared an answer in advance. I'm honored by the opportunity, sir. But I haven't decided yet which cultivation path to take. He then made a saddened expression, and shook his head as if cursing his unlucky fate. The two old men, within their minds, scoffed at Daniel's pitiful attempt of swindling them. They knew exactly what Daniel wanted, but still, they feigned ignorance. The old alchemist asked with curiosity, "What's the matter?" "You can tell us, I just wish I had learned more about the two types of cultivation. So that I could choose my path," responded Daniel with a voice full of self-hatred. The old master arms was the first to talk this time. He said, "How about this? We'll teach you martial arts and magic for a week. You'll then decide which path suits you better." He let the words sink in Daniel's mind, and then continued, "Then, after you break through to the 4th rank, you can take one of us as your teacher." The three were all aware of the hidden meanings behind the others' words, just as they knew that the other parties were acting, but for some reason, none of them interrupted the charade. An enormous smile grew on Daniel's face as he took a deep bow, and said, "Thank you, sirs." On the faces of the two old men, a faint smile grew. The moment Daniel straightened his back, the old master arms said, "Don't worry about it. You can go now, go see your sister, she is waiting for you in the lobby. Oh, and try to stay out of other people's room. Train starts tomorrow." Embarrassment and a bit of anger appeared on Daniel's face, as he bowed slightly and left the room. I like the brat. It's been a while since the last time a kid his age didn't puke his guts out when meeting both of us at the same time. Remember the brat of the Trickley house? Said the old alchemist right after being once again alone with his old friend. The old master arms remembered when that happened, and a nostalgic smile appeared on his face. I recall the reason for that being your previous invention of the high wolf repellent. Honestly, I still don't know how I managed to avoid puking myself. You smelled like a sewer. Uncalled for, retorted the old alchemist. When Daniel reached the lobby, he sighted Rayla sitting at a coffee table. Next to her, were a few young men and women. Daniel recognized these people. They were Riri, the girl with the folding fan, Nilo, the martial artist in leather armor, and Finn, the handsome-looking rapier wielder. The four were chatting happily, while drinking tea. Rayla was enjoying looking at how casually the other three treated each other. They were all proud children of powerful groups within Fury, and aside from Nilo, whom they met later, they had grown up together. At first, Rayla felt a stranger amongst this small group of friends, but in the past 10 days, she slowly became friendly with Riri, the most friendly amongst the two disciples of the Folding Crane School. The many interaction with Riri had led her to meet and interact with Nilo and Finn more often. And in the end, she had managed to befriend them as well. The four's chatter could be heard through the entire lobby, until a voice interrupted them. Sister.